The ancient caves of Skeleton Canyon had witnessed more blood and betrayal than any place in the Arizona Territory, earning their reputation as a graveyard for the greedy and the foolish. But on this sweltering summer day in 1882, they were about to become the setting for an encounter that would challenge everything the frontier believed about loyalty, justice, and the thin line between right and wrong. Rides Far had been tracking the stolen army payroll for 6 days, following a trail of broken promises and dead soldiers through the most unforgiving terrain in Apache country. At 31, he was the most skilled tracker in Geronimo's band, a warrior whose ability to read sign and predict human behavior had saved countless Apache lives during the endless cat-and-mouse game with the cavalry. His reputation extended far beyond his own people. Even Army scouts spoke his name with grudging respect and barely concealed fear. The theft of $40,000 in Army gold had sent shockwaves through every military post from Fort Bowie to Fort Huachuca. 3 soldiers were dead, their bodies found stripped and mutilated in classic Apache fashion. Every tracker, bounty hunter, and cavalry patrol in the territory was searching for the war party responsible, promising swift and brutal justice for what appeared to be another savage attack on civilized society. But Rides Far knew something the white authorities didn't. No Apache had taken that gold. The trail he followed told a different story, one written in subtle signs that only an expert tracker could read. The hoofprints were shod horses, not the unshod ponies his people preferred. The killings had been done with Army-issue knives, not traditional Apache weapons. Most telling of all, the bodies had been positioned and mutilated by someone who wanted it to look like Apache work but didn't understand the spiritual significance behind Apache battle customs. This was the work of white men posing as Indians, and Rides Far intended to prove it. But the most shocking discovery was what he found hidden in the deepest cave of the canyon network. As Rides Far's horse picked its way carefully down the narrow trail that led to the cave entrance, a sound reached his ears that made him freeze in his saddle, the unmistakable sob of a woman in distress. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he scanned the rocky terrain for signs of ambush, but the crying continued, echoing off the canyon walls with a quality of genuine despair that couldn't be faked. He dismounted silently and approached the cave on foot, every sense alert for danger. The opening was partially concealed by fallen rocks and desert brush, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom inside, Rides Far saw something that made his warrior's blood run cold. A young white woman sat, huddled against the far wall of the cave, her dress torn and stained with dust and dried blood. Her blonde hair hung in tangled ropes around a face that bore the bruises of recent violence, and her blue eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion. Scattered around her were canvas bags that had burst open, spilling gold coins across the stone floor like fallen stars. She looked up at his approach and screamed, pressing herself against the cave wall as if she could somehow disappear into the stone itself. But when Rides Far raised his hand in the universal gesture of peace and spoke to her in careful English, her terror gave way to desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "I know what you must think, but I'm not what I appear to be. I'm not one of them." Rides Far studied her face, reading the truth written in her bruises and the genuine fear in her eyes. "Who are them?" he asked quietly. "The men who killed those soldiers," she replied, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious pain. "My husband and his partners. They dressed like Apache warriors, used Apache weapons they'd stolen from previous raids. They wanted everyone to believe Indians had taken the gold. The implications hit Rides Far like a physical blow. This woman was married to one of the men responsible for the murders that had brought down the wrath of the entire U.S. Army on his people. Apache bands were already being hunted like animals based on evidence these criminals had deliberately fabricated. And that's when everything changed forever. "Why are you telling me this?" Rides Far asked, his dark eyes never leaving her face as he searched for deception. "Why would you betray your own husband?" The woman, she looked barely 20 despite the hardships written on her features, laughed bitterly. "My own husband? Thomas Brennan bought me from my father when I was 15 years old, like I was a piece of livestock. He's beaten me, starved me, used me as bait for his confidence schemes across 3 territories. The only reason I'm still alive is because I'm useful to him." She gestured toward the scattered gold with a trembling hand. This was supposed to be their big score, enough money to disappear to Mexico and live like kings, but they started fighting over the split before they even got back to camp. Thomas killed his 2 partners in their sleep, then came after me when he realized I'd overheard him planning to eliminate all the witnesses. Ridesfar felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You ran with the gold." "I ran for my life," she corrected. "The gold just happened to be what I grabbed when I heard him loading his gun. I thought if I could get it back to the army, if I could prove what really happened to those soldiers, maybe someone would finally believe the truth about what kind of man Thomas Brennan really is." The warrior studied her face for a long moment, seeing not just the obvious signs of abuse and terror, but something deeper. A steel core of determination that reminded him of Apache women who had survived captivity and fought their way back to freedom. "What's your name?" he asked. "Catherine," she replied. "Catherine Brennan, though I'd give anything to change it." "Catherine," Ridesfar repeated, testing the unfamiliar sounds on his tongue. "I am called Ridesfar. And you are right to run. Your husband and men like him have brought death to many innocent people. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." As Ridesfar knelt beside Catherine to examine her injuries, she reached into the bodice of her torn dress and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "It's all in here," she said urgently. "Every scheme, every crime, every innocent person they've murdered or framed over the past 3 years. Thomas kept records because he was proud of how clever he thought he was." Ridesfar opened the journal and began to read, his expression growing darker with each page. The entries detailed not just the recent Army payroll theft, but a pattern of crimes that stretched across the Southwest, wagon trains robbed and their passengers murdered, with the deaths blamed on Apache raids. Trading posts burned and looted, with Apache arrows left behind as false evidence. Even the massacre of a peaceful Apache family that had led to a cavalry assault on Ridesfar's own village was revealed to be the work of Brennan's gang. "How many of my people have died because of these lies?" Ridesfar asked, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and new rage. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Too many. I tried to warn people when I could, but Thomas watched me like a hawk. Any time I showed compassion or tried to help his victims, he'd beat me until I couldn't stand. He said it was my job to smile and keep my mouth shut while he built his fortune on other people's blood." The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, cutting through their conversation like a knife. Ridesfar's head snapped up as he recognized the rhythm, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace that suggested their riders were tracking rather than fleeing. "He's found us," Catherine whispered, her face going pale. "Thomas doesn't give up when money's involved. He'll kill us both rather than let that gold slip away." Ridesfar moved to the cave entrance and peered carefully around the rocks. 3 riders were working their way down the canyon, their eyes scanning every shadow and crevice. Even from a distance, he could see the military equipment they carried, army uniforms and weapons that would allow them to pose as soldiers if they encountered any real cavalry patrols. "Stay here," Ridesfar told Catherine, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition in his belt. "Keep the journal safe. If something happens to me, try to get it to the nearest army post." Catherine grabbed his arm as he started toward the cave entrance. "You don't have to fight them for me. I know what I am to you, just another white woman whose problems aren't your concern." Ridesfar looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are a woman who has suffered injustice and fought back with courage. That makes you worthy of protection, regardless of the color of your skin." Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. The battle that followed was swift and brutal, fought among the towering rock formations and narrow passages that made Skeleton Canyon a natural fortress for those who knew how to use its terrain. Ridesfar's intimate knowledge of every ledge and shadow gave him the advantage, but Brennan's men were experienced killers who fought with the desperate cunning of cornered animals. The first man died silently, Rides Far's arrow taking him through the throat before he could cry out a warning. The second managed to fire one shot that echoed off the canyon walls before a well-placed rifle bullet ended his threat permanently. But Thomas Brennan himself proved more dangerous than his hired guns, using Catherine as a human shield when Rides Far finally cornered him near the cave entrance. "Come out, Apache!" Brennan shouted, his arm locked around Catherine's throat and his pistol pressed to her temple. "I know you're in there. This doesn't have to be your fight." "It became my fight when you decided to murder innocent soldiers and blame my people," Rides Far called back, his rifle trained on the narrow gap between Brennan's head and Catherine's. "Your people are dying anyway," Brennan snarled. "The army's going to hunt you down like animals, whether I frame you for this job or not. At least this way, I get rich in the process." Catherine's eyes met Rides Far's across the dusty space between them, and in that moment, she made a choice that would echo through both their lives. Instead of remaining passive, she suddenly threw her weight backward, driving her elbow into Brennan's ribs and breaking his grip just long enough for Rides Far to take the shot. The bullet took Thomas Brennan between the eyes, ending his career in murder and deception with the finality of absolute justice. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. As the echoes of gunfire faded and silence returned to Skeleton Canyon, Catherine collapsed against the cave wall, her strength finally giving out after days of terror and desperate flight. Rides Far knelt beside her, checking for injuries with the careful expertise of a warrior who had tended many wounded comrades. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." Catherine looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude, exhaustion, and something deeper, a recognition that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. "You saved my life, but more than that, you believed me when no one else would have." "Truth has its own voice," Rides Far replied. "Those who listen with honest hearts can always hear it." Over the next several hours, as they gathered the scattered gold and prepared for the journey back to civilization, Catherine told him more of her story. She had been sold into marriage by a father drowning in gambling debts, trapped in a life of violence and crime with no means of escape. Her education, unusual for a frontier woman, had come from a schoolteacher mother who had died when Catherine was 12, leaving her with knowledge but no power to use it. "I can read and write in 3 languages," she said with bitter irony. "I know history, literature, mathematics, but none of that mattered as long as I was considered property instead of a person." Rides Far listened without judgment, recognizing in her words the same frustration he had felt watching his own people's knowledge and traditions dismissed as worthless by those who claimed to represent civilization. When they finally reached the army post at Fort Bowie, Catherine's testimony and the evidence in Brennan's journal created a sensation that reached all the way to Washington. The false Apache raids were exposed, leading to the court-martial of several officers who had used the fabricated attacks to justify brutal campaigns against peaceful tribes. Rewards were offered for information about other criminals who might be using similar tactics. But the most significant change came in the form of an official apology and reparations for the Apache bands that had been wrongly attacked based on Brennan's manufactured evidence. And that's when the most incredible transformation began. Catherine Brennan, no longer bound by marriage to a dead criminal, found herself in the unique position of being both wealthy. She was awarded a substantial portion of the recovered gold as compensation for her role in exposing the truth, and free to choose her own future for the first time in her adult life. She chose to stay in Apache country. Using her newfound resources, Catherine established a trading post at the crossroads between Apache territory and the white settlements, a place where members of both cultures could meet peacefully to exchange goods and information. But more than just a business, it became a bridge between worlds, a place where Apache children could learn English and arithmetic, where white settlers could gain honest knowledge about their native neighbors instead of relying on fear and prejudice. Rides Far became her partner in this endeavor, his reputation among his people and his growing fluency in English making him an ideal intermediary. Together, They created something unprecedented, a business relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals that gradually evolved into something deeper and more personal. Months passed before either of them acknowledged what was growing between them. The attraction was obvious to everyone who saw them together, but both carried the scars of past traumas that made trust difficult and love seem like a luxury they couldn't afford. It was Catherine who finally spoke the words that had been building between them, like pressure behind a dam. "I know this is impossible," she said one evening as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "I know there are a dozen reasons why we could never work, but I need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." Rides Far was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "Why is it impossible?" he asked finally. "Because I'm white and you're Apache. Because your people will never fully accept me, and mine will call me a traitor. Because we come from different worlds that have been at war for generations." "And yet here we are," Rides Far said simply. "Two people who found truth in each other when lies surrounded us on all sides. Two people who built something good together when everything around us was falling apart. If that isn't love, what is?" Catherine turned to look at him, seeing not the fearsome Apache warrior of white nightmares, but the man who had saved her life, believed her story, and stood beside her as she built a new future from the ashes of her old one. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Despite everything that should make it impossible, I love you." Rides Far reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Then we will make the impossible possible. We will show both our peoples that love is stronger than hatred, that understanding is more powerful than fear." The woman who had been sold as property had become a bridge between worlds, and the warrior who had spent his life fighting for his people's survival had found a new way to ensure their future. Through partnership, understanding, and the radical belief that love could triumph over the prejudices that divided their worlds. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the greatest courage lies in choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and hope over hatred, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of redemption, transformation, and love that defies every boundary society tries to build. From canyon hideouts to trading post partnerships, every story we tell proves that the strongest bonds are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. This is where two worlds meet and discover that love speaks a language everyone can understand.